All right, is that my cue?
Okay, so yeah. So no, my name is Frank Bound, and I'm not Rich Badiuk. I know that's what the label says, but Rich is out fishing on the James River on a couple of day trip. What a life, huh? And he's catching smallmouth. So I'm going to host today. I'm going to record today. This will be up on YouTube, and as soon as I can get it up. And we've got a good bunch of people today, and if you could mute, if you plan on watching TV or listening to radio, please mute yourself first. Today we got Duber Winters, and he's going to talk about how to select fly rods, fly lines, reels, leaders for the best fishing conditions. And we've got a May 8th club swap meet coming up at the clubhouse at 9 from 9 to 12. So whatever you learn today, you'll be able to go to the clubhouse and apply it to some nice used items. Well, a lot of people sell new stuff too that they collect. So Duber has been a guide, fly fishing guide. He has managed Orvis shops. He joined the club a few years ago and has already done a lot of classes, and even one on the water class. And I think I'm almost sure that he's our only Fly Fishing International certified casting instructor in the club. So we're gonna, without further ado, welcome Duber Winters.
All right, good morning, everyone. Go ahead and share my screen here. And flip on over to, there we go. Presentation and share that. Okay. All right, can everyone see the presentation?
I can see it, yep.
All right, good. Okay, so yeah, thanks for the introduction, Frank. Yeah, I've been a guide most of my adult life, which I don't know qualifies me to speak to this topic, but I have I've worked in many fly shops, and there's certainly different takes on different gear, and that can include loyalty to different manufacturers, to different people, relationships. But I'm going to try and break all that down today, so you all just have a little more of a clear picture of the industry as a whole, and what the differences are between a lot of this gear. And so Rich titled this presentation, Purchasing the Right Fly Rod, Reel, Line, and Leader for Different Fishing Conditions. And I added situations and preferences, because there's just so much that goes into to making the selection. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's a hand-me-down, sometimes it's a great price, and all that is fine. The whole idea is to get the fly in front of the fish, and basically any rod you select can do that. Just a matter of how well it does it and how hard you have to work in order to make that all happen. So with that, we'll go to, it's not letting me do that. Why not? Okay, so we have lots of different manufacturers out there. Here are 9 of what I'll say are some of the most notable, some of the top names in the industry. There are many smaller companies, all that make a lot of great gear. Some of these manufacturers just make rods. Some of them make reels, lines, and other companies go on from there. Orvis gets a bad rap because they make a lot of other things besides fly fishing gear. But Perkins, the owner of the company, told me at one point in time that if they only made fly gear, there's periods of time, they've been in business for over 150 years, they wouldn't have stayed in business. So with that, these manufacturers are certainly notable, and there's just a lot of choices. As you can see, our angler here has been overwhelmed, and it can give you a headache looking at all this stuff when you're finally ready to make a decision and get some new fly gear. It can be overwhelming, so we're going to try and break that down a little bit here today. And also, yeah, I know you guys have muted. That's a great idea, and thanks for calling that out, Frank. But if you have comments, questions, please, offer them. I have about 30 slides. I can't imagine it's going to take 2 hours to go through these slides. So I left plenty of time at the end to talk about it, but no need to wait. If you have any thoughts or comments, please just go ahead and fire away. So, criteria used for selecting a fly rod. There is the manufacturer. Does the manufacturer mean anything to you? Maybe you were on a trip one time and you stopped at a big outdoor store, and there was a rep from a manufacturer that you talked to, or you stopped or the manufacturer itself, you stopped at one of their stores. There is loyalty. Maybe there was a fly rod in your garage growing up as a kid, and it was your dad's favorite fly rod, and maybe that's a rod that you like that name, so you want to stick with that company. It can be regional for sure. Some manufacturers started making rods specific to their region. So, a New York State fly rod manufacturer maybe made a lot of trout rods. And then later, as time went on, the industry grew and they started to make rods for saltwater flats fishing, like bonefish, that kind of thing. It certainly can be regional. Marketing plays a huge role if you pay attention or are subjected to that marketing through websites or magazines. There is no doubt that the hot rod, if you will, of its time sells a lot of that rod. Local shops, and I think this is really key. I am a strong advocate for supporting local shops, and whether those local shops are part of a manufacturing group, or whether it's just John's Rod and Tackle, those dealers are often able to provide great information and support for the tackle that you buy. Another key criteria is the target species that you're going to fish. So around here, if we're out in the bay, we're fishing rockfish, or maybe just perch in the rivers. So maybe you're buying a rod specifically for that target species, or if you're an angler that likes to travel, maybe you're buying a rod specifically for a trip. Manufacturers are all keyed in on making rods specific for specific species of fish. And local waters, and I think this is probably a key point. You buy a rod for the water that you fish the most, and it's interesting to me that we would teach classes at the Orvis stores on Saturday mornings, and they were called Fly Fishing 101 classes, and they were introductory classes. And a lot of times folks would think about trips they're going to do in the coming months, and and want to buy a rod specific for that trip, which is great. But if you're not buying a rod for the waters around you, and that's going to be the only fishing that you're going to do, that's probably going to be a challenge, because fishing once a year for a couple days is fly fishing is, as we all know, is not necessarily an easy thing to do. So having a rod for the waters around you, whatever those waters are, be it a pond or a larger lake or a river or the bay or what have you, is really a good idea. Warranty, and this is again, I think, key. It's all over the place with different manufacturers, and we're going to talk about that. The warranty can make a big difference, because a broken fly rod doesn't fish very well, and warranties vary greatly amongst the manufacturers. So we'll talk about that. And then there's specific applications. And what I mean by that is, if you are looking to do some brook trout fishing up in Western Maryland or in the Shenandoahs of Virginia, you probably don't want to take a 9-foot rod into those back up into those little streams. There's a lot of canopy from the overhanging brush and trees, and those waters are very small, and you're really asking for trouble with a big rod. So I would refer to brook trout fishing, at least in our region, as a specific application. Another specific application could be two-handed casting, spey fishing. That is definitely specific application, requires specific equipment, as does straight line nymphing or Euro nymphing. Specific rods, specific line, leader. That is a specific application. All right. So each and every one of these manufacturers make quality gear. Let's get that on the table. If you told me I had to live and buy only rods from one of these companies, I'm sure that I'd never miss a beat. They are all top-notch manufacturers. They make great rods. It doesn't mean all their rods are super expensive, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But all of them make great rods, and they make different grades of rods. All right, so this term grade or word that I'm using is what I came up with to describe different levels of fly rods that a manufacturer would have. And we're going to say that, so A is, we're going to say, is the best and ultimately the most expensive. And we'll categorize that rod in the best level and that best grade from $600 to $900. And then down from that, we'll have a mid-level fly rod, which would be $300 to $600, an economy rod, which might be $100 to $200. And then lastly, D, a beginner package, which I always call it a grab and go, which you'll see them, lots of different places. Orvis had them, Bass Pro has them. And that's, where the rod, the reel, the fly line, the whole deal is in this little package, and you just grab this package, walk up to the counter, they scan it, and you take it home, and there you go. So we're going to categorize these different grades of rods, and it's important, I think, to note that most manufacturers have these different grades of rods, and if they don't have all of them, most of them have at least 3, and some maybe just 2. But the general differences between these rods, and we're going to drill down on this too: the quality of the components, how they are produced, where they are made, and then the warranty that comes or does not come with the different rods. All right, so golfing and fly casting, the analogy is used all the time, and I use it all the time, and I think that the golf swing and the fly cast are very comparable. So the analogies and commonalities between the golf swing and the fly cast are often appropriate and seemingly endless. When working with someone on purchasing a fly rod, and I would be asked, why would they spend $900 for an outfit when they can get a $200 outfit that looks exactly the same? You know, you look at it, it looks the same, feels the same. And more times than not, I would use the golf analogy for myself. And I'd say, you know, if I were buying a set of golf clubs and I were going to the range to hit balls, and I purchased a, you know, I don't even know how much golf clubs cost, a $3,000 set of golf clubs, and I went to the range and I had that set of clubs there on the tee box, and then if I had a beginner set of clubs also right there on the tee box, and I were to hit balls with the top notch, the expensive stuff, and then hit balls with the less expensive stuff, I probably wouldn't see a lot of difference in where the balls would or wouldn't go, because I don't have a good swing. I'm not a great golfer. It's not something I do. And for someone that doesn't fly fish a lot, a $900 rod probably is not going to make a big difference to someone that would use an introductory level rod or a grade C or a grade D rod. So from that perspective, there may not be a huge difference. However, if you see yourself continuing on in the sport, and you're going to do that, and that is relative, right? So how much are you going to do this? Are you going to do it going on a couple times a month and seasonally when it's nice out, or do you see yourself really getting into this, and you're gonna you live near water and you're going to be on that water, you bought a kayak, you're going to be out there, then your casting is going to develop. And as your casting develops and your skill and technique develops, that's when you're able to start to realize the differences between the higher end equipment and the introductory stuff. So what I would tell folks is, hey, look, if you think you're going to get into it, maybe don't get that grade D rod, because it's only $100 or $150 or whatever it is, but you're going to grow out of it if you're going to go ahead and pursue the sport. So maybe you want to go a notch up, and so they are some of the things to consider. You can reach plateaus where the quality or grade of the equipment can limit your development. And that is the same with golf as it is for fishing, as it is for fly fishing. And with that, the gear has gotten so much better, right? So 15 years ago, this introductory level stuff was just not very good. And it was almost unfair for a new fly angler to be subject to some of that gear, because if you stuck with it, you really only could develop so far. And it's better today. The gear is better, and at all levels the gear is better. So with that, these differences really start to come into play when you talk about the better rods. So general differences between fly rods are this: quality of the components. So what are the components? The cork. Does the cork have a lot of filler in the voids and cracks? All right, so there is premium cork, and there's different grades of cork, and it's really easy to see when you see fly rods on a rack at a store. If you look at the cork, some of the better cork will be brighter. It won't be as dark, but when you look closely at it, a lot of the fissures, the cracks and the openings, they'll put filler in there to fill that void, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And more times than not, that filler, that putty or whatever is in there, will stay in there. It doesn't pop out as much as it used to. But premium cork looks nice, and I'm not so sure about performance, because when it is kind of off topic, but over time, if your cork starts to get slippery in your hand, what you can do is just take a little really light fine grit sandpaper or something like that, and or just some Dawn dish liquid or whatever, and a little 3M pad, and clean it up and rough it up a little bit, and that'll give you a much better grip on that cork. But there is a difference in cost to the manufacturer when they buy that cork and put it on the rod. So it is something to consider on a fly rod. The reel seat, and I think back to a rod, the bass rod that I use. One of the bass rods I use is a 5-weight. It's an Orvis rod. It's about 8-10 years old. I forget the name of that rod, but really nice rod, casts really great. But it is a really cheap reel seat. I noticed it as soon as I got the rod, and it works fine, and it holds the reel. But there's definitely a difference between that and the higher end anodized aluminum locking reel seats. There are reel seats that are plastic too. And again, it's fine. You think about longevity and really how much you use it. The bottom line is, it comes down to how much you're going to use this stuff and how it's going to hold up. Guides make a big difference. You may not notice it early on, but they do. Are they recoil guides, or are they chrome snake guides, titanium or chrome stripper guides? They do make a difference in the weight of the rod. They make a difference in how the rod actually loads and bends. And you'll find on the premium rods, the rod you spend more money for, they'll have those recoil guides. And then number two, how are they produced? Are the rods mass produced, or are they made in small batches? I do forget the actual numbers, but Orvis has a rod called a Clearwater, which is a fantastic rod. It's a $200 rod that is made in China, and I think the number of those rods that came through quality control in a day was something like it was in the hundreds. So these rods they're pumped out. It is a systematic approach to the manufacturing. That compared to the rods, the Orvis rods that are made up in Vermont, those rods, they actually once the rod is produced and it's ready to have the guides whipped on to the rod itself and lashed in. Those rods, they would have this isn't sexist. They would have women in the town of in the small town of Vermont come and get these rods, and they'd take them home, and they would and they would whip on with thread and tie on these guides and then bring them back to Orvis, and then they'd put some finishing coats on. And the number of rods that came out in a day was, I think it was like 30 rods, and they didn't come out every day. So the point of this is there's much more detail that can go into some of these rods that are produced in smaller batches. Again, the end result may or may not affect the angler and their fishing, but it also can. It can make a difference in the performance of the rod, but certainly the overall quality of the production of the rod. And where are they made? So is it USA or overseas? It's just like anything else. If you want American made, you're going to pay more. And that is the bottom line. It is with just about everything today. You're going to pay, you're going to pay less for something that looks just about exactly the same for something that's made overseas. It costs more to buy stuff that is made in the US. And warranty, I think this is important. It's not just about how long the warranty is for. It's not a matter of it has a lifetime warranty. And a lot of manufacturers have scaled back to 25-year warranty, which is, at my age, it doesn't really matter. But it's the truth. It's not so much the time frame, but how do you execute the warranty? So your rod breaks, all right? You've had the rod for 7-8 years, and you like the rod, you want to get it fixed. So what do? You maybe go to the website of the manufacturer, or you call them and they say, yep, we'll take care of it, ship the rod back to us. And when I say they'll take care of it, they'll say, ship the rod back to us, and we're going to look at the rod and see whether it was a manufacturer's defect, or whether, the rod, whether you were using the rod to as a push pole on the flat because you got stuck in grass, or you know what I mean? So the point of this is the warranties vary greatly amongst manufacturers. And I've always felt like the best deal was to be able to take it to the shop or the dealer where you got it and say, hey, this broke. And, they have the right size boxes to ship this up. A lot of times you'd pay for the shipping out there, and then they'd ship it back. These are different things to consider when you're going to buy a new rod. Obviously, it doesn't apply so much when it comes to buying a rod at the swap meet. But if you're going to go buy a brand new rod, it's definitely something to consider. Back in the mid 2000s, G. Loomis had a warranty called the Expediter, and it was for fly rods and for spinning rods. And I have a lot of G. Loomis spinning rods, and they were great rods. They are great rods, but they break, and they broke a lot back then. They were high modulus rods, and Gary Loomis always said, I can make a rod that won't break, but you won't want to fish it. That was his little coined expression, and I like that. But that warranty was, I would call Loomis and say, hey, I broke a GLX 843, and I'd like to do Expediter. And they would have a brand new rod at my door in 2 days. It cost me $55. And I would take the broken rod pieces, put it in the rod tube that they shipped it in, put a prepaid package, prepackaged label on top of that tube, and UPS would take it and send it back. It was the best warranty in the world for a guide at that time. So there's a lot of different ones out there, and you should certainly consider them.
Hey, Duber,
when it
quick
comes to-
question on warranties.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is
Yeah,
Ryan. Do you know if any manufacturers have transferable warranties? So if you were to buy a used rod, or are they mostly just first time purchase, and then like anything else, it's if you didn't buy it from them, then you don't get the warranty.
Yeah, it's a great question. And some do, and many have absolutely no way of knowing whether you are the original owner or not. Um, so most manufacturers are going to ask you to register the rod, and yes, it varies with manufacturer, but let's be clear here. When people ask you to register something, they're asking you to do that because they want your data. They want your information. They want your contact information, and some want to share it and sell it, and some won't. But they want to be able to contact you so that they can promote to you going forward. It doesn't mean that they will not support, and I'm really speaking from the perspective of Orbis and what G. Loomis used to be when the rods were made in Washington. But I think the answer is yes, Ryan. You just have to, you got to look at each one individually. They are not all the same. So, criteria loyalty. Do you own or have you cast a rod from a company or dealer that you like? A lot of times you go back to the same manufacturer. Region, do your friends or others in the area fish a certain rod? That can influence decision. Marketing is a certain rod getting a lot of hype, magazines, websites, etc. I'll reference G. Loomis again. They have a rod right now. I'm going to forget the name of it. I can't. Yeah, I should have made a note of it. It is a super hot rod, and it is a great rod. It is a great for someone that has a very aggressive stroke. It is a performance rod. But it's hot, so everyone wants it. That's what people are talking about. That may or may not influence your purchasing decision, but these are just things that go into the decision making. Is the rod the favorite of your local shop? So your local shop's going to promote the rod that they like, and as well they should. Target species, you mentioned that before. Is the rod being purchased for brook trout, bonefish? Local waters, will the rod be fished on large open water using sinking lines, floating lines, casting heavy and large flies? Specific applications, as I mentioned before: tight line nymphing, spay casting, billfish is a specific kind of rod. Tenkara is a specific type of rod. We talked about manufacturer and warranty. Is the same weight rod for different seasons. So when I lived in Key Largo and would fish bonefish, I had a 9-foot or a 9-weight rod that was my flats rod for the winter, and in the summer I had a 7 and an 8. Because in the winter, in the Keys, I mean, you think it's always beautiful, and while it always may look beautiful, that wind will blow. And when that wind blows, you need more power. And a 7 or 8 weight rod would not deliver the fly in the wintertime. So in the wintertime, I had a 9 weight rod for the wintertime, and then an 8 or a 7 for summertime. So different criteria that goes into.
Hey, Duber, before you move on, what is
Yeah.
spade casting? I'm not familiar with that term.
I should have pulled up some pictures. So spey casting is two-handed casting. Have you ever seen someone, a picture or a video of someone streamside where the rod has an exceptionally, the rod is longer. They're 12 to 14 foot fly rods. And the cork is also longer. I'm going to say 2.5 feet of cork with an extended butt section past the reel. And the idea, basically, you are roll casting, but an exceptional length of line. This is there is no back cast with a spey cast. The line is always in front of you, and the line creates drag when you go to execute a cast, and that loads the rod in order to make the cast. This style of casting is or fishing is very popular for Western steelhead and salmon, but it's gained great notoriety in the East over the years. It is an exceptionally efficient way to cover water and also to get that fly down, because a lot of times these rods use different weighted head systems. So think of it as a sink tip, but the tip may be 20 to 30 feet. So, and that's why it's really popular type of fishing for big rivers. When you're fishing steelhead and salmon on these big rivers, a lot of times these fish will be laying deep in the water column, and you need to get that fly down. Well, if you're using the kind of rods that we use around here, and you're casting, let's say you get a good cast and, you get it out there 70, 80 feet, and you need to get down 18, 20 feet, that fly is only going to be in front of the fish for a real short period of time. If you are using a spey rod, you can get that fly down and in front of the fish for a much, much longer drift. So I apologize. Maybe I could have called that out.
Explanation. Thank you.
Is that explanation?
Yeah, no, great. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I remember, and I do not have any spey gear. It's something that I would like to do. It's just, quite frankly, only so much time. And but I had a fellow that worked for me in Richmond that was going to Michigan to fish for steelhead, and he was fishing with a guide, and the guide said, don't even bring any of your single hand casting rods. It's completely inefficient. I have gear to cover you. And Dale was a little taken back by that, but he found out when he got there, it basically would have been an exercise in futility. You just, there are applications where spey casting, and lastly on spey casting, it has developed and adapted that the rods now, you can get what's called a switch rod, which will switch between two-handed and single-handed casting, and most switch rods might not be 12 to 14 feet, but they might be 11 to 12 feet long. So it's still realistic to false cast and do back cast with that rod, but it also has an extended butt section, so you can also use it as a two-handed rod. Is that pretty clear? Is that good?
Yeah, absolutely. What will be interesting is when we have that hands-on casting session, if someone had one, could bring it so people could see it.
So I think it's a good time to ask Joe. Joe, if you're there, do you have do you have a spey rod?
I think Joe
Okay.
signed off. He had to go. His back was bothering him.
Got it. Okay. I don't have one. Maybe this is a good opportunity for me to get one and bring it to the casting demo. The one thing about it is just like when you do a roll cast, it really helps to have water in front of you, because the water creates drag on the line that really helps to load the rod. But I'll look at that. I've wanted to do it, and you know, that's where it stemmed from. It stemmed from these large rivers, but the South River in down in Virginia in Waynesboro, those guys, I really enjoy those fellows. They're pretty creative and advanced, and they do some spey casting for trout on their rivers. And the other advantage is you can cast bigger flies, and that is definitely a trend that is happening. It doesn't mean that you don't throw others. It doesn't mean nymphing doesn't take place, but you can throw flies that are literally 6-7 inches long. And I remember having a conversation streamside. This was just 2 years ago on the South River. There's a fella, I was just there fishing one afternoon, and he was carrying a spey rod, and we started talking about it. And never forget what he said. He said, it's basically all I do anymore. And I said, why? And he said, because when a fish eats the fly, you got him and he got you, which means that, which what he meant was, you're not fishing light tippets. So that fish is not going to break off. And the likelihood, not to say it doesn't happen, but the likelihood of a 9-inch fish eating a 6-inch fly is not great. So you're usually catching bigger fish. So it's a different game, and you don't get the bites. You know, you're not going to catch as many fish. So it's pretty cool stuff. I've always been enamored with it. I've done some casting at casting events, but never actually have done the fishing, and I look to. So anyhow, that's a little bit on spey casting. So fast or slow action rods. I thought this was a good little diagram. Hopefully it's clear enough for you to see. A fast action rod bends at the tip. A slow action rod bends towards the middle of the rod. And, you know, growing up as a kid, I always thought, well, you know, I've always wanted my Mitchell Garcia spinning rod to be really, really flexible. And the more it bent, I would always say, look how great this action is. This is great action. And it took until I started fishing the Susquehanna actively and started to catch quality fish, smallmouth, that I realized that you know, there's a reason that fast action rods exist. From a spinning rod perspective, you have much better control over the lure that you're presenting, and you also have much greater sensitivity. That bend of a slow action rod in the middle of the rod doesn't mean sensitivity. In fact, it's just the opposite. You have less sensitivity, and typically because it's a lower modulus graphite on a rod that will bend deeper into the middle of the rod itself. So from a fly fishing perspective, when you talk about the cast, slower action rods are more forgiving. And that means, I was just talking about that G. Loomis rod that's really popular right now. Almost thought of the name, but I didn't. It is not a beginner's rod. Your cast has to be pretty darn sharp in order for that rod to prove itself. If you do not have a straight line path of the rod tip with your false casting, it's not very forgiving. It's just not going to perform as well. But a slower action rod, maybe a moderately fast action rod, kind of covers up some of our weaknesses when it comes to the cast, and we all have them. There's no question about it. So a slower action rod can also deliver a more delicate presentation. So think about dry fly fishing for trout. You know, you don't want a real powerful cast to get that fly to slap down on the water. You want that line to lay out nice and straight in the air and then flutter down. You want that fly fluttering down to the water surface, and you get that from a more moderate action rod, or you adjust your equipment to do so. Now, faster action rods can generate more line speed, and that's why they can be better for open water. And when I think of flats fishing for either bonefish or redfish, you're on the bow of the boat. There's always going to be a breeze, almost always going to be a breeze. And you need to generate line speed and power in order to deliver that fly. Faster action rod can accommodate that. Faster action rods can create greater distances in different conditions, as to where a moderate action rod can be a better option for beginners. Any thoughts or questions on fast or slow rods?
I had a question. This is Andy
Yes.
Grosco. If you were nymphing, which I guess I don't really need long cast for the way I nymph, would you be better with a softer action or a faster action?
Yeah, I'd say a moderate action rod, and it really doesn't matter so much. You're right, because the cast isn't important. You're lobbing, that rig, 20 feet in front of you at the most, something like that. So more and more, there's an emphasis on sensitivity when it comes to nymphing. And I think that is a direct result of straight line nymphing or Euro nymphing. And I think at some point in time, I would like to do a brief presentation on straight line nymphing. It is phenomenally interesting. If you folks aren't familiar with it, the information is out there. If you Google it, and it is a highly effective way to fish nymphs for trout. There's no strike indicator involved, so they refer to that as a suspension device, which is exactly what it is. And you are really relying on sensitivity. You are seeing the sighter, that is, they call it a sighter, S-I-G-H-T-E-R. You're seeing the sighter hesitate when you are straight line nymphing, but you are also feeling, and I think that is translating into standard nymphing with a suspension device. So, to answer your question, a moderately fast action rod, if you're just looking at your strike indicator, I'm not sure how much of a difference it makes, because when that indicator hesitates, you're lifting no matter what. So I would say the rod that you like the best is really probably the best rod to use. Moderate fast, I would say, looking at that diagram, moderate fast to a moderate action rod. And that really is the case for just about most applications, unless you're going to have several different rods for one application. I would say just right in the middle there is best.
Thank you.
All right, so
the other
yeah, go
half of
ahead.
that was when you showed that moderate and all, what about if it's a 2-piece versus a 3-piece versus a 4-piece rod? Does that change what range you can get?
No, not anymore. It used to, but not anymore. It is these rods of today. I had some single piece rods when I guided in South Florida. I didn't need a rod to break down. They went from my boat into my garage and from my garage to my boat. And then I take the boat to the ramp, launch the boat and do the trip and bring them home, hose them off, put them away. And honestly, I could not tell any difference in the performance of the rod. That didn't used to be the case. So I really appreciate you bringing that up because I didn't put anything in this presentation about multi-piece rods, and I should have. When buying a rod, if you can get a 4-piece rod, it is advisable to do so, and that's simply for the travel aspect of it. If you are doing a lot of traveling and you want an even smaller package, the travel rods are pretty darn good these days, and those travel rods may be 7 or 8 piece. They do have or did have a tendency to break a little more often. At Orvis, we had one that it felt good, it cast great, but we did replace them a lot. Compared to other rods, they did seem to break. That may have changed. It may have just been an Orvis thing. I have absolutely no idea. But from a performance standpoint, I would not worry about how many pieces the rod is, whether it's 4, 3, or 2. But when it comes to getting around with that rod, be it on an airplane, be it in your car, depending on where you go and what you do, a 4-piece rod sure can make it a lot easier to get around with than even a 2-piece rod. It's my experience. Does that answer your question?
That was perfect. I borrowed a 4-piece rod once to go to Alaska, and I left it on the plane. Luckily, the next guy that took my seat was an angler, and he made sure I got that rod back. So my buddy that lent me the $900 rod never knew the difference.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, it is. It's a pleasure to share the sport with good people. And of course, we're not all the same, but thankfully that I just read another thread about someone that lost a rod, and someone was good enough to seek them out and get the rod to them. So. All right, good. I'm glad that helped. So the most common length of a fly rod is 8.5 to 9 feet. That is not to be argued with. They are the most common, and for good reason. You really, when you go to 8 feet, you can challenge your casting distance a little bit. And when you go to 9.5 or 10, depending on the application, it can be more difficult to deal with if you are fishing where there are trees, etc. Open water casting wouldn't matter if it was longer or not. So 8.5 to 9 feet is standard length. Standard fly rod weights are 1 through 12. You don't see a lot of 1s out there, but they are out there. There are also 13, 14, and 15 weight rods. They are typically used for billfish. So that's why I said standard fly rod weights are 1 through 12. The 5-weight fly rod is the most common freshwater fly rod purchased today. And the 8-weight fly rod is the most common saltwater fly rod purchased today. And quite frankly, between the two, you could cover a lot of different fishing applications. It really comes down to specialty applications, or excuse me, or the more you do it, the more you say, this 7-weight is, I don't need all this rod. When I started guiding on the Susquehanna River, Bob Clauser told me that I wanted an 8-weight rod to fly fish smallmouth. And it wasn't so much the species, but it was the flies that I was casting that I soon came to the realization for myself that I didn't need an 8-weight. and the 6-weight rod became my smallmouth rod, and I was able to throw those heavy flies no problem, and that rod worked great for me. Doesn't mean Bob was wrong, and it doesn't mean that I was, well, it meant I was right for me. So graphite versus bamboo versus fiberglass. Most rods are graphite. Bamboo is wonderful, fun, and interesting, and they need care. They need to be, when I say they need care, they will take on a shape unto themselves if they are not stored properly. And there's not much you can do with, as far as I know, with a bamboo rod once it's bent. So that is an important thing to consider, but they are wonderful. They are the making of them is the interesting aspect, I think, and they're a true pleasure to fish with. They're obviously more money too. And fiberglass, which is, the first fly rod I ever had, was my father's. That was, he had passed away, and I found these fishing rods in the garage, and one of them was this old yellow eagle claw fiberglass fly rod, short thing, and pretty awful fly rod comparatively speaking. But fiberglass has made a resurgence, and there are some fiberglass rod loyalists out there, and it's cool, man. It's another way to go. If I were to have one rod, I probably would not make it bamboo or fiberglass. It would probably be graphite, because it is just better for more applications, or more universally designed for more applications. But fiberglass is cool too. They're making some great fiberglass rods today. When you're buying a fly rod, don't buy off of the advertisement or the recommendation. Cast the rod, and that's the telling tale. You have to cast the rod to know if you like it. You can't just look at it. And if you're going to a store to buy the rod, you should cast 2 to 3 rods. And this is what I did for a living for many, many years. And people would come in and say, here's my budget, here's what I want to buy. And I'd say, okay. And I would grab 3 rods, and they'd say, why are you bringing that? And I'd say, well, 2 of these rods cost the same amount of money. They're different actions, but this other rod is a different price point, but I think you should cast it to compare. And it is always helpful, if you can, cast the different rods. And if you can do it in succession, meaning at one point and place, that is best. But you have to cast the rod if you care about how it's going to perform for you. Rod packages, rod reel, fly line, where it's all offered at a discount price, are a great way to go. However, upgrading the fly line can make a real difference. I put that in bold for a reason. I'll talk about that more when we get to fly lines. When considering buying from a smaller, new upstart company to an established company that is been around forever and is much bigger, it's just personal preference, and the risks. I mean, will the small company be around 10 years from now to satisfy the warranty if need be? Or maybe they will be the established larger company in a few years. The same way with just about anything you buy. Sometimes it's cool to support those new companies, and sometimes they have some pretty incredible gear to offer as well. So it really comes down to personal preferences. All right, so that's it on rods. I'm going to go into reels. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions on rods before I move forward here? Okay. All right, good. How am I doing on time? All right, that was an hour. So when it comes to reels, I do get frustrated when I hear folks say, you know, it just holds the line. And I get frustrated because I think about it from my perspective, because that is can be a true statement. There's no question about it. It just depends on the fishing that you're doing. And there can be much more to a reel and its performance and application depending on the type of fishing that you're going to do. So what's the criteria? Price, of course. The material, what is the reel made of? What weight rod is the reel for? What species will this rod and reel be used for? And that is a key factor to consider. Does the reel balance with the rod? Is a spare spool available for the reel? Is that important to you? And what kind of drag system? And does it really even matter what kind of drag system? All right, so when we talk about price and we talk about trout and bass reels, we'll say a good reel is 100 to 200 bucks, something like that. And a great reel will be $250 to $500. And some of you may say, I would never spend that much money for a reel. Good news is you don't have to. But others may say, you know what? I just got the rod of my dreams. This is the rod I'm going to fish with. I'm thinking for the rest of my life for trout, I'm going to put a quality reel on it. And that logic is hard to argue with, and it's also personal preference. Saltwater salmon, steelhead, bigger reels, and the reels become a more important component of your fly rod setup. A good reel in this class would be $200 to $350. And a great reel would be 4 to 6 or even more than that. So I put here that I put a picture here of Tibor. I don't know if any of you folks are familiar with these reels. They're made in South Florida, so it's American made, number one. They're bar stock aluminum. We'll talk about that in a minute. These reels are as premium as you can get. I bring them up for a reason. And when you look at this diagram, so this is a promotional piece that Tibor put out, and they put this out, believe it or not, to show how simple their fly reels are. And they've done that for a reason, because as the industry has developed and changed over the last 15 years, what's happened is fly rods have gotten lighter and perform better. And reels didn't right away. So what happened was someone would say, all right, I'm doing my trip of a lifetime. I'm going bone fishing. I'm going to the Bahamas. I'm going to go bone fishing. And again, 15 years ago, you buy this rod and the deal was get a good reel. That's what, and make sure you have 200 feet capacity of backing on that reel, which is smart, but I'm here to tell you, I have caught hundreds of bonefish and never has one been out over 150 feet. And if it ever would be out that far, you have absolutely no control over that fish at that point in time anyhow. But I'm not saying it's not a good idea. It's just not common to happen. But Tibor put this little slide together here for magazines and so forth to show the simplicity of their reel, and that's this series of reel. And as you can see, there's a lot going on here. There really is quite a few components. And what that does is it adds to weight. So what happened is these high quality reels, very expensive reels, started to kind of get a bad, not reputation, but they became a little less popular because they're heavy. And now you're taking this super heavy reel and putting it on a light fly rod, and it didn't balance. So there's other factors to be considered when you talk about something like this, like balancing the rod, because specific to bonefish, you're not making a lot of casts. And if you go to Belize, you may cast a lot because there's smaller fish and lots of schools and you see a lot more fish. But if you're fishing Bahamas, how many casts are you going to make in a day? So it's not like bass fishing where you're casting all day long. So it's less of a consideration to how that gear balances, if that makes sense, because you're not casting all day. But that said, really phenomenal when you think about how the industry has changed over the years. And now they're making reels that are super, super light and aren't super, super expensive and have quality drag systems to them. All right, so what is the reel made of? The best option is bar stock aluminum, and that is a solid piece of aluminum that is carved by a machine into the shape of a reel. The benefits are excellent strength to weight ratio, so they're super, super light, and they don't rust, they don't oxidize. So it can make a difference depending on what you're doing. If you would take a composite reel and catch a fish that would challenge you in any way, meaning that you're not just stripping that fish in. That fish is pulling line off of your reel. It's pulling, your drag is actually working. Torque starts to get involved, and the reel can actually flex or bend, and you don't want that to happen. You want your rod and reel to be one, and to be a strong point of contact between you and that fish. So that is more likely to happen in a saltwater situation, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen in freshwater situations. It does. Just depends on where you're fishing and what you're fishing for. All right, so other options of what a reel is made of are die-cast metal. Die-cast metal is heated metal, which is liquefied and it's poured into a cast to form the reel. These reels are not as strong as bar stock and can be bent and or break. Doesn't mean they will, just means they can, depending on the conditions they're fished under or how well you take care of your gear. Composite reels, which is plastic, are an affordable option for applications that won't be tested by the elements of the fish. Torque can make these reels bend or align outside its tolerances. These are typically not a lifetime reel in most circumstances. Again, it depends on the fishing that you're doing. All right, so when we talk about sizes of fly reels, and I think this is often confusing for folks. There's not a 2-weight reel, a 3-weight reel, a 4-weight reel, a 5-weight reel, a 6-weight reel. Rather, there is a reel that will usually accommodate 2 to 4 different weights. All right. So if you go over to the right side of the screen, I pulled this right off of the Nautilus fly reel website. Nautilus makes phenomenal reels, by the way. Their model of their X series, their XS, will hold line weights 3 and 4. And that to me says it's going to match up weight wise to a 3 or 4 weight rod. And then same thing going on down through the series, an X medium for a 4.5, an XL for a 6.7, and an XL max for an 8.9. And it's the same thing for the Orvis reel below that. You see the Mirage 2 is for a size 3, 4, or 5 weight rod. A size 3 or a Mirage 3 for a 5, 6, or 7, and on and on and on. So that's something to consider. Now, can you take a Mirage 5 for line weights 9 through 11 and put it on a 5-weight rod? Probably not. The foot of the reel, which is what goes into the reel seat, excuse me, starts to get bigger, and may not even fit into the reel seat of a smaller rod. So that's just number one. Number two, it's going to be too heavy, and it's not going to balance well. So back over here on the left, you see I put this in bold. The reel must balance on the rod, and what that means by balance is yes, you can take your finger and put it on the cork, and you're going to put it somewhere on the cork, and you're going to hold it up and say, look how well that balances. I suppose that's important, but it really just depends on where you put the finger, put your finger under the cork to make it balance. The key thing is when you hold that rod with that reel on there and your fly line on there and backing and you're rigged up and ready to go, it shouldn't be too heavy in the butt section. Conversely, it shouldn't feel too heavy on the tip. If you don't know any better and that's your rod and that's how it balances, the problem with that is as time goes on, it can affect your cast, and you may be compensating in your casting mechanics for a rod that is not balanced properly. So this is a big one for me. Retrieval rate and line pickup should be considered. When I fish, my trout rod, I usually carry several rods, but when I trout fish, but my go-to rod is a 4-weight. It's a 9-foot 4-weight, and I love that rod. And it has a smaller reel on it, and I don't love that. The diameter of the reel, it's a smaller arbor reel. And I don't love it because when I go to reel in, whether I am just reeling in line to string up the rod to go to the next spot, or if I have a fish on that I am playing, for each time I make a crank, I want to pick up line. I want efficiency. I don't want to make a lot of rotations to pick up the line. And it sounds like, I don't mean to sound elitist or whatever term you could think of, but that is something that bothers me. That is, I want a fast pickup rate, And when you talk about saltwater fish, it becomes critical because when that fish turns and starts coming towards you, and you have the fish on the reel, and you need to keep tension, you need to keep a tight line between that rod tip and the fly that's in that fish's mouth. You need for every rotation to pick up line in order to keep, so there's no slack between the rod tip and the fish. So it is something that to consider. Backing capacity should be considered if applicable. Again, tarpon for sure. If you're fishing open water, migrating tarpon, that fish can go and go and go and go and go, and there's nothing you can do about it. And ultimately, you have to chase the fish with the boat, and you need to have a lot of backing on that reel. Bonefish is another one. I mean, out here in the bay, if you hook a good-sized striper in 60 feet of water, that rockfish could test you on the backing that you have on that line, on that reel. But most reels today offer enough backing capacity that it's not an issue, quite frankly. All right, so this is, I think, crucially important. Often it's said, look, I'm a trout guy. I don't care about the reel. It's not a big deal. All it does for me is it holds the line. And that very, very well may be the case. And if for that person that has that perspective, if they fish the same 3 or 4 streams each and every year, and they're catching fish that are, maybe they get some fish that are, 15, 16 inches, and that's a great fish, or maybe even bigger. But if most of them are the size of the brown trout, which was what, a 9 or 10 inch fish, beautiful fish, on the left-hand side of the screen, yeah, that's why Tenkara exists. There is no reel. So you can certainly get away with that. But, the fish on the right, I didn't see that fish be caught. That was a trip that I hosted. That's the Jackson River, the Upper Jackson River, and Don had never caught a fish like that before. He caught, that is a migrating brown trout, by the way. That fish came out of Lake Moomaw and migrated up the Jackson River. He caught 2 of those fish that day, and they were both close to 30 inches. But the fish on the left was most likely stripped in. Well, I know it was because I saw it being caught, and the reel was not used. The fish on the right was hooked and immediately ran downstream, peeling off 60 feet of line. All right, so the reel was critical in playing the fish and bringing it to the net. So this logic applies to other species as well, and the waters that the species come from. If a river system is capable of strong flows and strong CFS, then a reel with a quality drag should be considered as critical. If not, if you're going to fish, if you're fishing bluegill, then it's not a factor. But the comment of, hey, it's just trout, I just fish trout. Well, it depends on where you fish and what fish are in that water, whether the reel is actually should be considered to be a key component. All right, so the arbor of a fly reel is, when you look at this diagram, there's 3 different fly reels: large arbor, mid arbor, small arbor. The arbor is what is inside the reel. It is that what the backing originally goes on to, and then the backing is connected to the fly line So it is that cylindrical metal arbor that is inside there. A large arbor is larger in diameter, all right, so that when you make a rotation with that handle, you pick up more line. Well, in order to get more backing on that arbor, the reel then has to get wider. So the arbor diameter gets bigger, but then the reel gets wider. That's a large arbor. A mid arbor is, quite frankly, a compromise between a large and a small. And a small arbor are the reels that, that I grew up with as a kid. And they are a very, very small diameter, and they are a very narrow reel. And the line builds out from the arbor vertically, if you will, to the ends of the reel itself, rather than with a large arbor, the arbor or the reel gets wider and the diameter of the arbor gets larger. So line retrieve and pickup, I think I've hammered that point home. Disc drag or spring and paw. Spring and paw is cool. It's got a neat sound to it. They are not smooth. Well, they can be, but the older generation reels are not super smooth, and maybe they don't need to be. It really just depends on where you're fishing and what you're catching. So these days, disc drags are extremely common, and there's more of those out there than anything else. And one thing that's important to a lot of anglers is, does it have an ingoing or outgoing signal? And that to me is very important. So when I hook a fish and that fish takes off and it starts pulling fly line and ultimately backing off that reel, the tone that is made from that reel indicates to me the speed at which that fish is moving. And often there's a lot going on when this happens. And when it happens, you're on the bow of in my mind, I'm on the bow of a boat, and that fish is taking off and it's pulling line. And when it starts to slow down, I can think, okay, now I can maybe crank up my drag knob just a little bit, put a little bit more heat on that fish because it's starting to tire, and I can adjust the pressure that I'm putting on the fish. So incoming signal can be important as well. It's less important to me, but it is something to consider. Backing capacity, of course, and the drag knob. I have a reel right now that is on my 5-weight, and I hate the drag knob on it. It's an Orvis reel. The reel is fine, very popular reel for them. But I do not like the feel of that drag knob. And I'm reminded of it when I pick up that 5-weight and I start fishing with it. So there are things to consider. Are they, and it really comes down to what's important to you. All right, so that was it on fly reels, and I'm just going to keep going unless anyone tells me not to, and we can talk about things in further detail once we're at the end here. Okay, so selecting a fly line for different conditions and applications. Lots of different lines out there. Floating lines, sinking lines, intermediate sinking lines, sink tip lines, matching the weight of a line to the rod, adding sinking tips. There are different textures to fly lines, and of course, quality, which directly relates to the price of a fly line. So when we talk about fly lines, Um, you know, the floating fly line is the most common. It's also the most friendly to cast. And it can be used for multiple applications, including surface and sinking flies. Weight forward floating, WFF, is the most common fly line, floating fly line. Double taper is an option, and excuse me, I've never owned a double taper line, but what it is, if you look at the diagram on the top here, fly line taper design, weight forward, that is the design of a fly line. Well, think about that taper being on one end of the fly line and then also being on the other end of the fly line. So you kind of have two different fly lines on one line. For me, I don't like this. I don't like double taper because when you hook a good fish, if it pulls all the fly line out, that thicker line, that taper that is on the other end going to the backing on the reel is going to come out through the guides. And I just don't want that. I think the purpose of a double taper is when a fly line wears out, and a fly line will wear out usually because the coating that is put onto the line begins to wade and wear away. And now the line isn't as slick as it was when you purchased it new. Then you can just flip the line around and use the other end. To me, and this probably comes from being closely connected in the fishing industry, these lines get better and better and better all the time, and they get more and more slick. So when I have a fly line that wears out, I'm cool with it. I'll just buy a new version. I'll just get a new fly line because they keep getting better. But everyone doesn't think that way. So they make double taper. Yeah.
Actually, the double taper is great for presentation. I used to fish a lot of dry flies, and you could lay it down so delicately. And the double taper is actually, the weight is in the belly of the fly line, and the ends are thinner. And so you could exchange one end for the other, and it'll still work. But it is not tapered like a weight forward at the front. It's much thinner at the front. And when you cast a small dry fly out with that, it lays on the water with hardly any disturbance. It's absolutely amazing. I used to fish weight forwards also, and you can see the difference when you do it side by side. Big difference.
So Joe, it's a longer taper too. I mean, it's still a taper, right? It still tapers down. It has to taper.
It tapers, yeah, it tapers from the middle down at each end. Whereas the weight forward is heavier in the first 30 feet of the line.
Yep.
Than the first 30 feet of the double taper. The double taper is heavy in the middle and thins down. You don't get you don't get as much distance with the double taper. But delicate presentations is fantastic with a double taper.
There you go. There you go, Joe. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I've never owned one. It's hard for me to speak to them. At Orvis, and this is 5 different Orvis stores that I managed from the Keys to Arlington, Virginia. We would have double taper on the wall as an option, and we just didn't sell many of them, and probably due to my lack of knowledge of them, and maybe if I would have fished them for that purpose, Joe, for throwing dries, I would have sold them to people that were dry fly aficionados. So that's, Joe, thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate it.
Yeah, that double taper can be considered a specialty line. The weight
Okay.
forward, with the weight forward, you could cast dry flies. It's just, the presentation is just a little less delicate, but you can do it. And you get more flexibility with the weight forward and what you can cast than you can with a double taper. But if you're strictly a dry fly fisherman, like I used to be for a while, double taper was the way to go.
Got it. Got it. Excellent, Joe. Thank you. So, and speaking of taper, taper can be species specific. When you go to that wall of fly lines in a fly shop, they're like, to Joe's point, there can be dry fly floating line, there can be redfish floating line, there can be bonefish floating line, and on and on and on. And what they typically mean is the taper is different of the line itself. Other things that can be different too are the coatings and how the line is manufactured. Some lines do not do well in cold environments. So a tropical type of line, a line that you'll use for bonefish, might not do well in a cold environment. And what I mean by that, what happens is the line will get a lot of memory to it and coil up. And so when it does that, you go to make a cast and shoot that line through your guides, it'll knot up and cause you a bunch of problems. So some lines are manufactured for hot and cold temperature, and then of course the coatings that they put on the lines as well. Sinking fly lines. So what the thing to note here is, what's the sink rate, and what do you want out of the sink rate? Sink rate is rated by inches per second. That is the fall rate of the line itself. An intermediate sinking line, they're very popular. They're great for fishing streamers in 1 to 4 feet of water. And they're typically not a real heavy sink rate. They're 1 to 2 inches per second. And one thing that's great about them is they're pretty friendly to cast. When it comes to a full sinking line, they can be harder to cast, or more challenging to learn to cast, I'll say. Sinking lines are rated by types. So for example, a type 1 will sink at 1 inch per second. A type 3 will sink for approximately 3 inches per second, and on for 5 inch for type 5. There are also sink tip lines, and only the tip sinks. So they're certainly great. I have them, I use them. These lines, because they're easier to cast. They can be easier to cast depending on the flies that you're throwing. But if you need to stay down and keep that fly in front of the fish for a longer period of time, and you're fishing water that has strong flow to it, it may not keep the fly down in front of the fish as long as a full sinking line. So, when approaching the purchase of a sinking fly line, it's similar to selecting a fly rod. You have to take a look at, what am I doing here? What water am I fishing? And that can direct you to the sink rate that you need to look for.
Hey, Duber, this is Don again. Question on the intermittent or sinking line in terms of spooking fish. Is the leader enough to keep from spooking the fish when the line's going through the water, or how important is that, or what kind of impact?
It is. Yeah, it is. Well, it does depend on what fish you're talking about here, because where does that fish swim? So fish get spooky in skinny water, right? So a fish that's in 2 feet of water is going to be much more spooky than a fish that's laying down at the bottom of 6 feet of water. And ultimately, the leader or the line that you're using and the leader that is on the line will have that direct related effect. If you're throwing to a fish in skinny water, then I want a longer leader, and I'm probably only needing a floating fly line because the water's skinny. But if I need to get down, I'm worrying less about spooking that fish, Don. And whenever you're using any kind of a sinking line, you are not using you should not be using a long tapered leader. So if you're using a sinking line, be it intermediate or type 135 full sinking, at the end of that fly line, all you need is a straight piece of 4 feet, 3 feet, fluorocarbon, tippet material, whatever pound test you need. And because you're getting down, the fish aren't seeing as well, you really don't have to worry about spooking the fish. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's contrary to what I thought. So that's good news.
Yeah, that really is, in a nutshell, that is it. So I think I've called these out before in other presentations. I use these things a lot, and they are a poly leader that they're anywhere from 9 to, I'm not sure how long the longest one is, maybe 12 feet, something like that. And you loop to loop it onto your fly line, your floating fly line. And at the end of it is a little piece of tippet material. And what I do is I take that tippet material, I cut it off, and I just create another loop. So I have 2 loop to loop connections. And now what I do is I'll take, as I was just saying, a piece of fluorocarbon, and I'll just create a loop on one end, and I go loop to loop at the end, and then I tie my fly on, and I'm good to go. I use these in the bay. I use them in the river next to my house. I use them for trout. They are a really good option to get your fly down. Yes, there are applications where I need a full sinking line, and where I do is when I'm out in the bay and there is good flow, there is good current flow, and I'm marking fish in 40 feet of water, where guys are anglers are dragging umbrella rigs to get down to those fish, or jigging with a big heavy jig head. I'll use a full sinking line in that application. But more times than not, these things are awesome. From the manufacturer, I copied this right off the website. Poly leaders are like mini fly lines that are constructed the same way with a PVC coated mono core. They are tapered and act as a natural extension of your line, tapering down to your tippet. They cast beautifully, and that's one big part of it. And they allow you to fish the water column. They're available in clear floating, intermediate 1 to 5 inch sink, fast sink at 4 inches per second, and a super fast sink at 6 inches per second. And each leader has an exposed monocore tip to attach your tippet, and however you choose to do that. So it's an option, and it's one that I use. So buying a 5-weight line for a 5-weight rod is a no-brainer. Makes good sense. However, fast action and tip flex rods can perform better when strung with a heavier weight line. So what's that mean? Putting a 6-weight line on a 5-weight rod. It's become pretty common these days. This is called overlining. and it can help bend or load the rod to make a more efficient cast. It is often not recommended to overline a slower action rod, because if you have a slower action rod, a 5-weight rod, then that 5-weight line is gonna, when you're casting, is gonna go ahead and bend or load that rod just fine. But some of the newer, I shouldn't say newer rods, some of the faster action rods that only bend at the tip, when you want to get more of a bend into that rod to create more line speed and get more power into the cast, overlining the rod, going up 1 weight, can be an effective way to do that. A high-end, top quality fly line will contribute to making an average fly rod cast like a top of the line rod, and contribute to allowing a top of the line rod to cast to its potential. Most notable fly line manufacturers make great fly lines. All of them do. Rio, Cortland, Airflow, Scientific Angler, Orbis. When possible, it is typically best to buy the highest quality fly line available. It makes a measurable difference. So I mentioned this rod earlier today, the Clearwater rod that Orbis has. I can't tell you how many of those rods I've sold. And because they're a good price point, you know, it's a $200 buck setup, but I would rarely let, and people would buy them in a package to get the Clearwater rod, Clearwater reel, and, you know, I'd string it up for them right there in the shop. And not to upsell, because I didn't care about that. But in order to make that rod perform better, I would often suggest that they buy a higher quality line. And so they'd go from spending 65 bucks for a line to spending 95 bucks for a line. The difference in price is considerable. The difference in performance is great. That's why I made this slide. I recommend, more times than not, getting the better line. It'll make your rod cast better, bottom line. Textured or smooth lines is just personal preference. If you're not familiar with it, textured lines are out there now. And another golf analogy, if you think about a golf ball is textured. It's got dimples. All right, so think about a fly line having dimples. It's not completely round or smooth surface. It's got dimples. So what that means is when the line goes through the guides, there is less surface to touch the guides. And some of these textured lines are pretty incredible. They will just slide through the guides effortlessly. All right, we're on to leaders.
Oh, I had a
What do they
question.
do? Yeah, go ahead.
I heard of teeny lines, I think it's Teeny.
Yeah,
What does a teeny line mean?
that's Jim Teeny. Jim Teeny is a gentleman that had his own line of lines, and this goes back to the mid to late 90s when teeny fly lines were really, really popular. And they were popular because of his, he was really the first to start making sinking lines that were castable. They were tolerable to cast. So a Teeny 2000, I even forget these days, but that's what that is. Jim Teeny is a gentleman, and he has, and I'm sure still does. I don't hear a lot about him anymore. He probably sold his system to someone, or I really don't know. But that's what it is. It's and quality stuff. He always had high quality gear, and so that's what Jim Teeny lines are.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Leaders provide the connection point for the fly. They deliver and present the fly along with the fly line. They reduce coil, but lay out the fly. They are made with the tippet attached. When you buy a fly line these days, that tippet is a part of the leader. Did I say that right? No. When you buy a leader these days, the tippet is attached. It is a part of it. You don't, there was a time when you bought a leader and then you bought tippet and attached it. I don't think anyone does that anymore. And if they do, I wouldn't know why. Tippet leaders can be monofilament or nylon or fluorocarbon. I don't know why I didn't put that in there. Are often the length of the fly rod. Knots for leaders we're going to talk about. And I don't know why I put this right here, but when you get a leader, look at it here, and it comes in a pack like this on the left, when you go to unroll or unravel that thing, always start from the butt section that has the loop on it. If you try to start from the tippet section, it is a mess and does not work out very well. So always start from the thick end and unravel it. All right, so this is what they look like. Of course, you know, I show Orvis because that's the stuff I sold and still use a lot of today and I'm familiar with. But again, everyone makes good stuff. A leader pack, you buy that leader because of the length and you buy it because of the diameter of the tippet. That's why you buy that. So that's a 9-foot leader. It's got a 5X tippet. And if you wanted a leader that was 12-pound tippet and you're fishing bass or rockfish, resident rockfish or whatever, and you want 12-pound, then you'd buy a 9-foot 12-pound. That 12-pound is referring to the tippet. It is a tapered leader, so the butt section is thicker. The tippet is, in this case, 5X. The tippet is added as the leader gets short. So when that leader gets down to 6 feet, you're going to take a piece of tippet material off of that spool and you're going to tie it to your existing leader to make it 9 feet again. When it comes to saltwater bass, and you can certainly do it for trout, really, you can just make your leader. It is so simplistic. You just need 3 pieces of fishing line, and you really don't have to have anything special. But there's different formulas out there to use. But you just need 3 different sizes of material. The butt section is the biggest piece. And if your leader's gonna be 9 feet long, I love the 4 feet of butt, 3 feet of mid, 2 feet of tip, and you just knot them together. And you can use, I'll talk about knots in a second, and then put a loop on one end and then your fly on the other and you're good to go. And more times than not, it works out fine. I think I use 40, 25, 12 or 45, 30, 20 for most of my bay fishing. Trout, I typically buy my leaders. That's just me. And for anything on a sinking line, you don't make your leader. You just take a piece of fluorocarbon, 4 feet long, and add it to your sinking leader. So knots for making leaders. You can make a perfection loop, so you can do your loop-to-loop connection, or you can do a double surgeon's loop. And then whatever knot you want to use, I use a back-to-back uni knot because I can tie them pretty quick and they I've never had one fail. For trout, when I am adding tippet to my leader, I'll often use a double or triple surgeon's knot because that is really small stuff. It's easier to see. And then of course or you could use a nail knot or a blood knot. And if you're good with those knots, then that's the knot you should use. That tied right, they won't fail either. But making leaders is not a super technical thing, and it is pretty easy to do. Difference between monofilament and fluorocarbon. Monofilament, which is nylon, is naturally buoyant. It floats, and it's best for dry flies and fishing poppers and surface flies. It is also less expensive. It also stretches. So you have less sensitivity with a nylon leader. When you're fishing a surface fly, a popper, doesn't matter because you don't need sensitivity. The fish is going to come up, eat the fly off the surface. You see it, you set the hook, you feel it. Sensitivity can be important when fishing a sinking fly. Can be, not always. But fluorocarbon wants to sink. It is best for subsurface applications. Has very little stretch, great sensitivity. It has better knot strength, and it is abrasion resistant. So quickly, to the point of this, fluorocarbon, when I would fish live bait in South Florida for snook, so hard to vision this, we would use pilchards, and they'd be about the size of a sunfish, you know, maybe 5 or 6 inches long. And on my spinning rod, I would have, it would be strung with Power Pro. So it is it's not monofilament, it's a braided line. And at the end of that braided line, I would tie on fluorocarbon. And that piece of fluorocarbon would be 3 or 4 feet long. And then at the end of that fluorocarbon, tie on a hook. And then I'd put that hook through that bait fish and then throw that bait fish out there towards the dock to catch a snook. And the reason I bring this up is I would never even begin to think about using monofilament to tie onto that Power Pro, that braid that is on that spinning rod, because when I would hook a snook, they're big, powerful fish, and they would run into the docks. And if I had monofilament tied on there, that monofilament would break instantly as soon as that line got near the dock piling, because of all the crustaceans that are on that they're super, super sharp. And, you know, the snook, it seemed like they knew that, you know, they would just get in there. They're going to safety, obviously, but fluorocarbon is much, much stronger, much more abrasion resistant. And that can be important whether you're fishing snook or not. But I just wanted to call out that example. It is a much stronger line. All right, so that's it. That's it for the presentation. I know I didn't talk about everything. I tried to hit the key points. And, you know, I know we can't be sitting dockside here with a couple beverages talking fishing gear, but certainly happy to answer any questions and talk about anything that y'all might want to talk about here.
I have a question.
Yes.
When you use this loop-to-loop connection for the sink tips, when you cast, do you get any hinging effect?
No. Nope.
Okay.
No. The hinging effect doesn't come from that connection, Joe. The hinging effect comes from the leader not being appropriately sized, be it thickness or length, for the fly that I'm throwing. So that's when that hinging comes about. So I'm trying to think of an example. Yeah, I mean, you know, if you're throwing a heavy clouser, and I'm noticing that thing is hinging. Quite frankly, what I do is I adjust my cast. I'm putting too much power into that cast. All right. So now what I'm going to do is, instead of putting so much power into the cast, I'm going to back off. If I'm in one spot and I know I'm going to be in that spot, let's say I'm on my stand-up paddle board, and I do this a lot. The way I fish from a kayak or a stand-up paddle board, I go to an area and I drop an anchor. And now I am where I want to be. And although I may rotate around, you know, with the wind, because I only have one anchor, I am now in a position to cast to my target. And if I find myself hinging in that application, but I still need to get the fly where to the target, then I'll add a length of something or take a little off. But that's where the hinging comes in, not from the loop-to-loop connection.
Okay, thanks. I always wondered about that. I was never sure.
Yeah, it's I am a strong advocate of the loop-to-loop connection, and I'm an advocate for people. Typically, I talk to folks that are learning the sport, not folks that have been doing it all their lives. So if you've been doing it a long time and you like to connect by a knot, then do it. You know, it's not like there's only one way to do this.
I guess I'm old fashioned. The first thing I do when I get a new fly line, is I cut the loop off, and then I glue a butt section, about 3 foot of nylon. I glue into the middle of the fly line, so I have a knotless connection. So it runs through the guides really easy. And then I tie the leader using a double uni to the that 3 foot butt section, because I like heavy butt sections, the roll over poppers and stuff, you know.
Yeah,
so that's what I do. And I just, for some reason, I just can't stand the look of a loop-to-loop connection. I just, you know, it's just an idiosyncrasy that I have that I just bothers the hell out of me, and I just cut them off.
And I totally 100% get that. And you know, that is, you're dialed in. You know what you like, you know what you don't like. I think the loop-to-loop connection was created to make it easier for folks, and it does. And I guess for myself, I've learned to live with it, and I don't notice any. I don't feel like I give anything up by doing it, but I totally get your approach.
Yeah, clearly loop-to-loop is the most practical, but I'm on the other side of the spectrum on that one.
I get it. I get it. All right. Anyone else?
Yeah, I've got a question for you, Duber.
Sure, Barry.
My next purchase is going to be a 7-weight rod, and I'm definitely going to buy a floating line to go with it. I was considering buying a intermediate line also, and I've heard this talk about these sink tips for the last few meetings we've had, or a few seminars we've had. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think with an intermediate line, the entire line sinks. Whereas, okay, I see your head nodding.
Yeah.
So there's got to be an advantage to buying the intermediate line rather than trying to use the sink tips, other than, you know, saving money by doing it that way. I wonder if you could address that a little bit. I'd appreciate it.
You bet. You bet. And you're exactly right. So there are probably manufacturers out there that still make, excuse me, that make lines called density compensated. And they were made for exactly what you're talking about. It is a level sink of the fly line. And it makes complete sense. And if you're making good long casts, that really does come into play, because you don't have part of your line up here and then the part of your line up here because it's floating, and then the rest of your line coming down like this to the fly. So in other words, it's all coming down at one level. Makes complete sense. And I love, when I was guiding in South Florida, at night we would fish snook on dock lights, and just about all I used was intermediate sinking lines, and they cast really, really well. Couple things to think about. Are you going to have two different reels, or are you going to have a spare spool to switch out between the two? So in other words, is it a game day decision? Are you going to be out fishing and say, all right, I want to switch from floating to my intermediate sinking? How am I going to do that? Am I going to do it by switching my spool, putting a different reel on, or are you not going to do it at all? You can't switch over. Or do you have two different rods? You know, there's different approaches to that. But that is one thing to think about, is what is your setup going to allow you to do to fish a sinking and a floating line? And you know, the other thing is, intermediate sinking lines are not a fast sink rate. Their inches per second are usually 1 to 2 inches, something like that. They are phenomenal in keeping a fly, let's say a clouser, in the strike zone, keeps it from coming up to the surface. But it's not a real heavy sink rate. So however you plan to approach it, I would just think about where the lines are going to go. In other words, spare spool, a whole nother reel, or am I just going to take the floating line off and put the intermediate sinking line on, which I wholeheartedly recommend against, because it's a pain in the butt. You can only do it at home. So, you know, even if you just have, the reels aren't that expensive these days, you know, 2 reels or a spare spool, whatever works for you. But I think those are things to think about. And the other thing is, you can just buy a floating line and try a sink tip, because they're cheap, and see how it works out for you.
Right. I have the spools, I have the reels, so that's not an issue. My concern was more the effectiveness, and particularly on the retrieve, if the intermediate line wouldn't give you a better, more realistic retrieve too. Thank you.
Just think about sink rate. That's all, Barry. You know, just think about how far it's going to get down for you and what you're fishing for.
Thank you, sir.
Duber, it's been 2 hours. I just want to give you a heads up. I've learned a hell of a lot of stuff, good stuff. In fact, I'm going to pull out all my gear and look and see what the hell I bought all these years. And so I'm going to keep the meeting open, but I'm going to stop the recording soon, because it's hard to upload a big recording to YouTube.
Sure. Okay. All right. Thanks, Frank. Yeah. Any other questions?
Well, I have a question. It's almost embarrassing. My favorite fly rod, I brought it home. I set it near the couch. My daughter rarely sweeps vacuums the floor, but sure enough, she vacuumed the floor and she sucked my fly rod in. I lost the last 3 inches. I took it down to Talkerman's and they fixed it. Now I have like a psychological thing that fly rod's not really good. Is it okay? What would you say?
I'd say it's okay, unless you have a psychological thing that's, that's bothering you. Because yeah, okay is relative. You know, I mean, I would venture to guess losing 3 inches off the tip of a fly rod would make it not perform the way that it was originally intended, and ultimately affect your cast. That would be my guess. You know, I didn't talk about this in the presentation, but I'm going to bring it up. If you have a favorite fly rod and You fished that rod for 20 years, and that rod has always done well for you. It always will do well for you, as long as you don't pick up another rod. Because when you do, now you're in trouble. Because these rods today, I mean, these rods, when you put a good line on them, it is effortless to make a cast. And it sometimes it is dumbfounding. It's like, oh my God, I've been working so hard for so long to make this cast. And that's what happens is I wrote this down, I didn't say it. At Orvis, we were at a guide rendezvous one time. And so now you have guides from all over the country. And we were talking about the difference between the Clearwater and the H2. So that's a $900 rod at the time and a $100 rod. And the overall consensus that we came to on performance is that on a Clearwater rod, we can make the same cast, we just work harder to do it. And that really sums it up, I think. The other thing is, and it's not an example of these rods, but a rod that makes you work harder to do it might limit your ability to become a better caster. And that is where this better equipment, and not just the rod, but the line that goes on it, can really make a difference in your casting and ultimately maybe your fishing. So hard to say, 3 inches off the rod tip. You know, it might be a time to come to the swap meet, cast a couple rods and compare them, you know, and that's a great opportunity to do that. You can compare. And that's the thing to do if you're willing to buy a new rod.
No, that's good. What about the cork? I mean, Lefty Kreh